Mr. President, today I come again to the floor to speak about the ongoing challenges that we face in our relationship with Iran, about some of the benefits that we've seen through the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Agreement on the nuclear program that Iran has now significantly set back, and some of the challenges that we face going forward. Mr. President, we'll hear from a number of my colleagues in the 45 minutes to come, and I'm grateful that they too are coming to the floor today to talk about the balance, what there is that we can recognize about the progress we've made under the JCPOA and what there is that remains to be done and that remains as a challenge. There are some who believe that having reached so-called implementation day means that we have settled our scores with Iran, that there are no more concerns we have, and that we can now expect a complete and positive change in its behavior. But in my view, this couldn't be further from the truth. Now more than ever, we cannot afford to take our attention away from Iran. My colleagues and I are here today to explain why we must do more to strictly enforce this deal and to aggressively push back on Iran's bad behavior outside the nuclear deal's parameters. My personal concern is that if we don't do this effectively, this landmark nuclear agreement may not survive, even into next year. Let me just at the outset say that there's been some encouraging developments in recent days. It is hugely encouraging to see an American, a U.S. citizen like Jason Rezaian from the Washington Post, returned to United States soil and reunited with his family. Someone who had been unjustly detained and sentenced without foundation is now once again free. A journalist, the best and brightest of American journalism, is now free and back to the United States. I also wanted to recognize former Marine Amir Hekmati, who was arrested while visiting his grandmother in Iran and was also unjustly arrested and detained and is now also free in the United States. But I wanted to move to another topic for a moment by way of introduction. In the past week alone, the Iranians have signaled that Iran is open for business again, as Iran's leaders have hosted Chinese President Xi Jinping, and Iranian President Rouhani has traveled to Europe to meet with the Pope and leading officials from the French and Italian governments. Mr. President, just a few weeks ago, Iran was still an international pariah. Business deals with Iran were illegal. Today, some foreign governments, some who are supposed to be our vital partners in enforcing the JCPOA, at times seem all too eager to resume business ties with the regime. Just at the outset, I might caution those allies of ours to be mindful that American sanctions remain in place against Iranian bad behavior, whether it's their support for terrorism, their human rights violations, such as detaining, arresting Americans without foundation, or their illicit ballistic missile program. So to further expound on the challenges that we face and the importance of having the resources here in the United States government and in the International Monitoring Agency called the IAEA that we need to be successful in enforcing this deal, I'd like to invite my colleague from the state of New Hampshire to rise and share with us for a few minutes her thoughts, having served on the Foreign Relations Committee, having closely studied this deal, and having looked forward at what the opportunities and challenges are for us in the weeks and months ahead.
Mr. President, I'm delighted to be able to be here to join my colleague from Delaware to talk about what's happening with enforcement of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And if we want this to succeed, one of the things we need to do is to make sure we support the IAEA, the international agency that is charged with monitoring and verifying Iran's compliance with the agreement. And so I want to address that first, and then I want to talk about some national security nominees who are also critical as we think about how we enforce this deal. First of all, we all know that the IAEA is absolutely critical to the international non-proliferation system and to the enforcement of the JCPOA. Their employees are working day in and day out to verify critical aspects of the agreement's implementation that prevents Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. And just for example, on December 28th, Iran shipped more than 12 tons of low-enriched uranium to Russia, where the fuel is stored in a facility that is guarded by the IAEA. The IAEA has increased the number of its inspectors on the ground in Iran. They've deployed modern technologies to monitor Iran's nuclear facilities, and they've set up a comprehensive oversight program of Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, the IAEA is constantly enhancing and improving its efforts. For example, earlier this month, they installed the Online Enrichment Monitor, or OLEM, to verify that Iran keeps its level of uranium enrichment at up to 3.67%, as they committed to under the JCPOA, so keeping it at that 3.67% level. Now, this prevents Iran from enriching uranium to a point where it could conceivably be used in a nuclear weapon. And this is new technology. It was developed by the IAEA with significant support from American scientists at our Department of Energy National Labs. As a result of the JCPOA, this new system can be used in Iran. Now, the IAEA resources devoted to verification and monitoring are also increasing considerably, with personnel devoted to monitoring Iran's nuclear program increasing by 120%, and the number of days monitors spend in the field by 100%. And if we want the IAEA to be successful in making sure that this agreement is successful, we need to provide robust financial support so that they can deploy the best scientists in the world for inspections and that they can deploy the best equipment to monitor Iran's compliance. IAEA Secretary General Amano has called on member states to provide long-term funding for the IAEA's additional activities in Iran that are estimated at approximately $10 million a year. And if we think about this cost, that's a really good investment for America as we prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. So I know that I have other colleagues here on the floor who want to speak, so I can wait and talk about nominees after they've had a chance to speak, if that makes sense.
That would be fine. I think there's a strong point being made by my colleague from New Hampshire that I'll just briefly expound upon and then invite my colleague from New Jersey to join this conversation. Just earlier this month, I traveled with a number of my Senate colleagues to the headquarters of the International Atomic Energy Agency and heard from them directly the same sorts of concerns my colleague from New Hampshire has just laid out. They are struggling with how to ensure that they've got the resources, the staffing, the equipment to take on this remarkably broadened scope of inspections. One of the underappreciated positive benefits of the JCPOA is that the IAEA now has unprecedented 24/7 access, not just to Iran's nuclear enrichment sites, but to its centrifuge production workshops, its uranium mines, its uranium mills, the entire so-called fuel cycle for the production of nuclear material within Iran. So I believe, as does my colleague from New Hampshire, that the IAEA needs and deserves greater funding, more reliable funding, more robust and long-term funding. The oversight and monitoring mechanisms in the JCPOA, if strictly enforced, can serve as a viable deterrent to Iranian cheating, and in a worst-case scenario, provide the international community with early warning and enough time to respond if Iran decides to break out and dash to a nuclear weapons capability. But access to all of these sites is only valuable if the IAEA has the resources it needs and has asked for to conduct thorough inspections. So I think my colleagues and I will be working together with the administration and others of our colleagues in the months ahead to authorize not just an adequate level of funding 1 year or 2 years in advance, but to put in place a long-term, reliable source of funding. I think, as my colleague from New Hampshire said, there could be no better investment than in ensuring deterrence through vigorous and comprehensive inspections to prevent Iran from ever renewing its dream of access to a nuclear weapon. We'll press the administration to work with all of us on this and to make this a higher priority going forward. But the idea that we've got world-class nuclear scientists in the United States and that the IAEA has world-class nuclear inspectors and that together they've developed new technologies and can deploy new and highly skilled teams to do this monitoring in Iran, that's a great opportunity. But it's only meaningful if we contribute the resources to ensure that those inspectors do their jobs. So let me now turn, if I might, to our colleague from the state of New Jersey, who wanted to speak with us about some of the pros and cons of this critical turning point, Implementation Day.
I want to thank the senator from Delaware for his remarks, and really thank my colleague, Senator Shaheen, as well, for really emphasizing what I think needs to be emphasized, is that we have in the IAEA a ability to do the most intrusive inspections ever before seen on the planet Earth. But that agency, which is important, the point that Senator Shaheen was making, that agency needs to be funded. It needs to be funded well. We need to make sure the international community is standing there, and America needs to lead in that way. I anticipate hearing Senator Shaheen also make the point, though, that it is the height of malfeasance for us here in this country not to have people in the right places to do the other things necessary to hold Iran accountable. You can't sound like a hawk around the debate over the JCPOA and then sound like a chicken when it comes to putting the funding forward necessary to prevent them from getting, prevent them from engaging in destabilizing activities in the region. And I'm grateful that Senator Shaheen will make that point further, but I just want to review again what has been accomplished come implementation day, because it still is an extraordinary victory for diplomacy in taking the specter of a nuclear-armed Iran and eviscerating and pushing it back at least for 15 years. And so that in that region now we have the specter of a nuclear-armed Iran pulled back, and we have the ability for moving forward with greater and greater diplomacy. And in order to get there, some pretty extraordinary things have happened. We have now effectively blocked Iran's uranium pathway to a bomb with 12 tons of an enriched stockpile. Nearly all of its stockpile, virtually all of its stockpile, has been shipped out of the country, and 2/3 of the Iranian centrifuges have been taken offline. It's a significant removal of the uranium pathway. In addition to that, we've done the blocking of the plutonium pathway. The heavy water reactor at Iraq has been filled with concrete. It's no longer operational. It's been permanently disabled. This has made sure that that pathway to producing weapons-grade plutonium has been eliminated in the foreseeable years in the future. And again, it's established that unprecedented monitoring. The IAEA has gained unprecedented 24/7 access to monitor all of Iranian nuclear-related facilities, including its mines and mill, the whole range of the pathway towards a weapon. We now have intrusive monitoring and intelligence gathering capabilities that we never had before. And so most recently, Secretary Kerry was able to call on his Iranian counterpart, Zarif, and secure also the release of sailors. And the reason why I say that, this really quick turnaround of the sailors being released, is it shows that these historic steps with the JCPOA has put us in an environment where making diplomacy work in other areas are critical. Now let's be clear, and these are the important points that I want to make, is that we must be vigilant as a Congress. We must be vigilant in this body to make sure that other areas of Iran's activities are being watched in every single way, and that there actually are repercussions for any Iranian violations of its nuclear agreements. This first step is impressive, historic, and has really done a lot of good in removing the nuclear threat, at least for 10 to 15 years. But it must come with real repercussions for any violations. The only way to ensure the path of diplomacy is validated is to hold Iran accountable. It must meet all of the commitments, not just those for implementation day, but during the whole process of the JCPOA, the many years ahead. And again, the oversight and engagement of Congress on the monitoring and verification provisions of this agreement are absolutely vital. And that's in many ways a chorus of conviction amongst my colleagues speaking here tonight, to make unmistakably clear that we have eyes and ears on this agreement. All of my colleagues are saying on the floor today that we expect Iran to test the boundaries of the JCPOA. But if there are signs that Iran is not abiding to the terms of the agreement, we are firm in our conviction that Congress must not hesitate to levy new economic sanctions, isolate Iran diplomatically and financially, and use security and military measures if that's what it takes to keep them from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Iran's obligations under the JCPOA are ongoing and must be continually verified. It is one thing for Iran to cooperate sufficiently to achieve the transfer of frozen assets and the dismantling of the international sanctions regime. It's quite another, though, for it to cooperate in an ongoing basis after these aims have been achieved. That is the responsibility of the administration and this Congress. And the JCPOA must serve as one part of a larger strategy with Iran. This is about the nuclear agreement and pushing the specter of a nuclear-armed Iran back. But this is just one part, must be just one part of a larger strategy with Iran. The diplomatic success of the JCPOA is commendable, as I've said, but tensions between our closest partners in the region and Iran remain high. Having just been there myself, we see the concerns of the Israelis, of Saudi Arabia, of Turkey. And Iran is continuing its destabilizing activities, testing ballistic missiles and further inflaming tensions in the region. These events demand that we are even more attentive and engaged so that our allies and others know that the U.S. will not hesitate in the face of Iran's continued defiance of international rules and of order. The implementation of the JCPOA, again, is an important step, but as a standalone strategy, it is just not enough. In addition to this, Iran has been a bad actor in non-nuclear areas, and the U.S. needs to hold it responsible. And in addition, therefore, to the accountability measures we're taking for the nuclear regime, there must be an understanding that we cannot allow the Iranians to grow the shadow of this agreement to cover all of their other non-nuclear destabilizing activities. Congress and the administration must be prepared and must be willing to levy the appropriate economic sanctions needed to respond robustly to these destabilizing activities. I believe it is unacceptable for us to move forward in any way and allow Iran to flout international law, to violate any of the balance of the agreements that they have made, and we need to make sure that we meet them. Iran could try to use additional funds that they've received through this deal to do things that undermine regional security. This cannot be allowed. We must continue to work closely with our allies and respond to every single bit of Iranian aggression that undermines this, international order and violates international agreements. With that, I want to turn it back quickly to Senator Coons to again continue this dialogue.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank my colleague from New Jersey. I'd like to emphasize a point he made there at the closing, that we need to remain vigilant. We need to remain ready to impose additional sanctions on those actions by Iran that are outside the JCPOA. And we've seen 2 launches of ballistic missiles by Iran late last year, designations recently having been made of those who were involved in supporting Iran's ballistic missile program. And there's other bad behavior by Iran, violations of human rights that led to the long and unjust detention of Amir Hekmati, and also potentially their increased support for terrorism in the region. I'd like to invite my colleague from New Hampshire to help us understand what barriers there might be to the administration of vigorously enforcing the sanctions that remain on the books here in the United States if we as a body don't act, do our part in making sure that the administration has the resources that they need.
Well, thank you, Senator Coons. As we know, one of the challenges is having people in place in the various agencies that can enforce this agreement and can hold Iran accountable. And that's where I think we've got a real challenge, because we have a number of nominees that need to be approved, but there are 3 that stand out as particularly important. First is Tom Shannon, who is nominated to be the State Department's Undersecretary for Political Affairs. Second is Laura Holgate, who is the U.S. Ambassador to UN offices in Vienna, nominated, and included in those offices is the IAEA. And the third, and maybe even the most important as we think about future sanctions on Iran, is Adam Szubin, who has been nominated as the Treasury Department's Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Crimes. Now, Shannon was nominated on September 18th. His nomination is currently on the floor. Holgate was nominated on August 5th. Her nomination is pending in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But Szubin was nominated on April 16th, and his nomination has been held up in the Banking Committee despite the support that he has from the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Now, I know that a number of my other colleagues are going to speak to these nominees, but I would just like to point out that Last week we had a hearing in the Foreign Relations Committee on the implementation of the JCPOA, and one of the witnesses who had not been a supporter of the agreement, Michael Singh, was a witness at that committee hearing. And I asked him about Adam Zubin. And he described him as a good guy who had done great work for the country and whose nomination should go forward because it allows us to continue to look at the sanctions regime and what we need to do. You know, the reality is, and I'm sorry to say this because I think it contributes to what the American public is concerned about when they look at us in Washington and what we're doing. But I think these nominations are being held up for purely political reasons. Has nothing to do with the background of these candidates, with their expertise, with what they would do on the job. This is about individuals within this body who are trying to hold these people up for their own political gain. And I think this is a delay that's harming the national security interests of the United States. It's something that every one of us ought to be concerned about. We ought to be yelling about this because it is long past time that we confirm these individuals, let them do their jobs, and continue to do everything we can to protect this nation's national security. So thank you, Senator Coons, for organizing all of us to come to the floor today to talk about what we need to do as we're implementing the Joint Plan of Action.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen, and thank you for your service to the state of New Hampshire. And I just want to emphasize again that these three nominees, Tom Shannon, Laura Holgate, Adam Zubin, have been waiting for months and months. And in particular, Adam Zubin is a nonpartisan career professional, having served in both Bush and Obama administrations, being the lead enforcer, the lead investigator in sanctions, who's now been nominated to take on the top role in the Department of Treasury in making sure that our sanctions have bite and stick. Why we wouldn't proceed on a bipartisan basis to give this administration the senior officials and the resources it needs to enforce sanctions to keep us safe, to make sure that this nuclear deal is enforced. Whether you voted for it, against it, supported it, or opposed it, I can't comprehend why any senator would consent to the ongoing months-long delay in these vital nominees being confirmed so that the administration can do the job I believe all of us want them to do, which is to enforce sanctions against Iran for its bad behavior.
Will my colleague yield?
Of course.
It's my understanding that Adam Zubin has been held up in the Banking Committee and that we have never heard a reason why he's being held up in that committee. Is that your understanding as well?
That's my understanding as well, is that there is no publicly articulated basis, certainly no basis that has anything to do with his qualifications, skills, experience, or relevance to the job. And as is the case with all three of these nominees, look, there are many other nominees we could be talking about, whether for judgeships or ambassadorships or senior positions. These three we've chosen to focus on today because they are so directly relevant to America's national security and to the successful enforcement of this complex nuclear deal with Iran. As I said, and as Senator Shaheen said, and Senator Booker said earlier, the IAEA has incredibly broad scope to investigate what's going on in Iran. But if we don't have the senior people in our government, in the administration, that can take action when things are discovered in Iran that we want to be active in taking on, or when there is bad behavior outside this nuclear agreement, we have no one to blame but ourselves as a body here for failing to provide our administration with the senior leadership and the skills and the resources needed to really defend America. I'd like to encourage and invite my colleague from the state of Connecticut to add, as he wishes today, both the positives about Implementation Day and the concerns he might have going forward, such as these vital national security nominees that Senator Shaheen and I have just been discussing. Senator Murphy?
Thank you very much, Senator Coons. Thank you for convening us here. I think it is important just to restate the progress that we've made. I know it's been said before, but frankly, not enough attention has been paid to the fact that since Implementation Day, Iran has shipped 12 tons of enriched uranium out of Iran and kept enrichment at that 3.67 level, which is significantly below what's necessary to create a bomb, that they filled the core of the Iraq plutonium reactor with concrete, preventing them from producing weapons-grade plutonium, and they've started to allow the IAEA access to the entire nuclear fuel cycle of uranium enrichment, including their centrifuge production shops and uranium mines and mills. And of course, as has been stated before, the IAEA has been given an unprecedented level of access to the entirety of the supply chain leading up to any future potential development of a nuclear weapon. That's an unprecedented level of access that will require an unprecedented level of support. We're talking about an additional $10.6 million per year that the IAEA is going to need to carry out these oversight responsibilities. Now, the United States puts up a percentage of IAEA's funding, but it's still the minority of funding. And one development that we need to guard against are attempts here in Congress to undermine this agreement in very quiet, subtle ways. There is a bill that's been introduced in the House of Representatives, Senator Coons, that would disallow the United States from funding the IAEA unless it grants the United States access to the contents of proprietary bilateral arrangements. That would have the result of stripping the funding necessary to carry out this agreement. If the IAEA doesn't get U.S. funding, then it simply can't have the purview that it has been granted by virtue of this agreement of the entire fuel cycle throughout the country. And so as important as it is to get the personnel in place that can enforce this agreement, that can root out the ways in which Iran may take money that they get by virtue of this deal to support terrorism in the region, it's also important to make sure the IAEA is properly funded as well. And Senator Coons, the only thing that I would add to this discussion is this. I think for those of us that supported this agreement, and I'll speak for myself here, I supported it because this was the most effective way to stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, period, stop. That with this agreement, we were much more likely to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon than we were without this agreement. But we certainly accepted the premise that it is in our long-term security and strategic interest as a country to facilitate the transition of power within Iran from the hardliners who have chosen a path of Iranian foreign policy to be simply a provocateur and an irritant in the region, to the more moderate elements that would like to see Iran once again re-engage on big questions of both regional and global security. Now, I don't think you can count on that happening. And I don't think anybody should have voted for this agreement or supported this agreement because they were counting on that being the end result. But you have started to see a different level of engagement, whether it's with the release of the prisoners, as you spoke about, whether it was about the resolution of the detainment of U.S. personnel. And we will shortly see whether or not this battle that plays out almost every day inside Iran is ultimately accruing to the benefit of the moderates. We'll have elections next month in Iran. And so I think we should support this agreement because it strips from Iran the ability to rush to a nuclear weapon, and you see the evidence already in the steps that they've taken since the implementation agreement. But I think we should read with some level of positive interpretation some of the resolution of crises that we've seen just in the time past over the course of 2016. That doesn't mean that there aren't still enormous issues still at stake, but it is in our security interest, and it was part of the discussion of this agreement to ultimately bring Iran to a place in which the will of the vast majority of that country be expressed in the leaders that speak to the world community. So I thank Senator Coons for continuing to bring us down to the floor. I think as important as it is to talk about the positive steps that have been taken since implementation day, it's also important to note that we have a lot of work undone whether it be funding the AIEA, confirming these important positions. And we have a lot of work to do in terms of remaining vigilant about the quiet, subtle ways that may be undertaken in this body and across the hall in the House of Representatives to try to undermine this deal that is working. Thank you very much for convening us, Senator Coons.
President, I'd like to thank my colleague from Connecticut for his active and leadership role on the Foreign Relations Committee and his deep interest in this topic. And by way of transition to my colleague from Pennsylvania, I just briefly wanted to point out this picture of the Arak heavy water reactor in Iran. It is, to me, a symbol of both what Implementation Day and the JCPOA promises positively and the unresolved risks that it presents. Implementation Day has only been reached because the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, certified to the world that Iran had taken the very core of this reactor, capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium, and filled it with concrete, rendering it useless for the production of significant quantities of plutonium. That is a significant step forward. But when a reporter asked me the other day, does Iran still pose a nuclear threat to the United States and our vital ally Israel, I said, of course. When asked why, I said, because they still possess the knowledge, the resources, the engineering, the uranium in the ground, in the mines, in the mills of their country, and the engineers and the facilities to, at some point, enrich once again to weapons grade. So if we don't stay on this, if we don't fund the IAEA effectively to conduct this oversight and these inspections, if we don't stay attentive to this issue, we will simply wake up again at some point 5, 10, 15 years from now and discover that what we have in Iran is a nation that has translated its natural resources, its rich uranium deposits, and its engineering know-how into once again being in a place to threaten the world. So I'd like to invite my colleague from Pennsylvania to talk about how our regional vital allies perceive the path forward and what concerns he's got and how he sees Implementation Day.
Mr. President, I wanted to, first of all, thank Senator Coons and my other colleagues who are working on this. Very important to walk through where we are in the process. If I had to step back at this moment and say, well, now that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is moving forward, that we're beyond Implementation Day, what do we have to look for over time? And if I had to boil that down to 3 words, or really 3 goals, that we must work towards every day, and on some days it has to be the United States on its own, and other days working with allies, those that participated in this agreement and signed it, and partners in the region. But the 3 words, I guess, would be, as implementation is going forward, we've got to focus on 3 goals: enforce, counter, and deter. Enforce, making sure the agreement is enforced at every step, and I'll get to the issue of the consequences for violations of the agreement. Counter, number 2, meaning countering the Iranian aggression in the region. That's why it was so important that the President and the administration that he leads was very clear about the designation and the sanctioning of the Iranian regime as it relates to ballistic missile launches and their activity. And then third, deter. We have to have a deterrence policy that stays in place and, if anything, is strengthened over time. If we do a good job on those 3 things over the next several decades, literally, enforcing the agreement, countering the aggression, and deterring them, we will have the result that we want years from now. First of all, on the question of consequences, like a lot of members of the Senate, when I made a decision about the agreement, I wrote down page after page, walking through my reasons. At the time, I wrote the following, quote, "We have to prepare for the possibility that the Iranian regime may violate the agreement and may even engage in activity constituting significant noncompliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action," unquote. That's what I wrote several months ago, and that still holds true today. We must not trust in Iran's compliance. In fact, some may say that using President Reagan's old formula, which was trust but verify, in this case, and I'll be blunt about this, these are my words, in this case, until proven otherwise, we must mistrust and verify. Mistrust the regime and verify. That's just the nature of where things are right now. So we've got to verify vigorously any asserted reason or action that the Iranians would take. And also in the process of doing that, we got to work with our partners to ensure that any violations will be met with swift, multilateral consequences. That means we need other nations to help us. We can't do this on our own. We cannot know whether and how the Iranian regime might violate the agreement. For example, we might see them drag their feet on allowing the IAEA access to certain nuclear sites, especially ones where covert activity might be suspected. I firmly believe that hardliners in Iran will be watching how we respond to any violation. The best way to condition behavior, the best way to impact what they might do, the best way to cause in them a second thought down the road is to enforce aggressively violations of the agreement. So it's important that we work in lockstep with our European partners to prepare for these violations. I hope it doesn't come to pass, but I think we have to assume, and I will assume, that they will violate the agreement. Many of us met with our European friends before making decisions about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. We need to continue these conversations to ensure that as businesses and business ties increase between the Iranian regime in Europe and other parts of the world, we've got to remain unified in our stance on the potential Iranian violations of the deal. So that's about violations. Second and final point briefly, but so important to our deliberations and our actions, our friend and ally Israel. Our relationship, the relationship between the United States and Israel, is unbreakable. Unbreakable. And we've got to make sure that as we move forward with the implementation of the agreement, that we insist that our policy reflects that unbreakable relationship, and also continuing what has been very strong support for Israel for many years, if not generations now. But we have to recognize at the same time that Israel faces significant threats from Iran and its proxies, especially Hezbollah and Hamas. We also have to assume that Iran will continue its aggression in the region. That's why I talked about countering that aggression before. And we have to assume that Iran will try to expand its support for terrorism. We've already taken some initial steps to expand cooperation with Israel on defense and homeland security, including beginning consultations towards a new 10-year Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, as we know it by the acronym. That Memorandum of Understanding on defense cooperation is vital in initiating new efforts to address, among other threats, the terror tunnels that Hamas has constructed and threatens Israel all the time. So I urge the administration to focus on capabilities that Israel requires to face both conventional and asymmetric threats, to engage, I should say, to ensure that the new Memorandum of Understanding constitutes a transformational investment, not just one budget year to the next budget year, appropriation to appropriation year, but a transformational investment in our bilateral relationship with Israel going forward. We should meet with, we should all meet with Israeli leaders to hear their firsthand assessments of the threats and to reassert our mutual interest in countering Iranian aggression. So, Mr. President, I want to yield the microphone to our colleague, Senator Coons, again, but I do want to thank him for his leadership and for what I believe is a bipartisan determination that we have to do everything possible to enforce this agreement aggressively with consequences when there's a violation, counter Iranian aggression in the region and beyond, and deter over what will be more than one generation. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank my colleague from Pennsylvania for his clear-eyed assessment of the challenges that lie ahead as we try to move past implementation day and into a positive world where we might together be able to provide the administration with the resources they need to enforce the agreement, to counter Iran's bad behavior, and to deter Iran from any further illicit or bad behavior. And I'd like to invite my colleague on the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Kaine of Virginia, to offer any thoughts he might care to at this point before we bring this colloquy to a close. I know that Senator Kaine has closely followed the importance of the inspections regime under the JCPOA, and as Senator Shaheen and I both referenced earlier, full and robust funding of the IAEA is the only way to ensure that they really have the ability to enforce this agreement, to make sure that this heavy water reactor does not somehow get redesigned, re-engineered, and restarted in the future. And I'd like to invite my friend and colleague from Virginia to offer his thoughts on how we make sure that we are effectively enforcing this deal.
Mr. President, I want to thank my Senate colleagues for taking the floor on this important matter. And while I serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I actually want to talk about this issue from my standpoint on the Senate Armed Services Committee. I happen to believe that one of the most valuable military assets we have as a nation is information, intelligence. And in that capacity, what we have under the JCPOA is a dramatic ability to learn, sadly, from tragic mistakes. After more than a decade of war in Iraq and thousands of lives lost, we know that operating in an environment where we base national security decisions on what we don't know rather than what we do know can be tragically costly. This week, over the weekend, there was press about a recently declassified report from the Joint Chiefs of Staff on weapons of mass destruction. It was submitted to former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in September of 2002, around the time Congress and the administration was trying to decide whether to invade Iraq. The report that was given to the Secretary of Defense, and it was not widely shared among the administration or Congress at the time, confirmed that our officials at the very top levels of the intel and military community knew very little about the actual status of Iraq's WMD program. The report concluded that what we suspect is, quote, based largely, perhaps 90%, on analysis of imprecise intelligence. While the national security apparatus was acknowledging that it was operating in the dark, it was nevertheless planning for war. On March 7, 2003, 2 weeks before the beginning of the Iraq invasion, the IAEA presented to the UN an updated report on Iraq's nuclear activities, and here's what the report said. That they had conducted 218 nuclear inspections of 141 sites, and they concluded at the time there was no indication of resumed nuclear activities since 1998, no indication that Iraq had attempted to import uranium since 1990, no indication that Iraq had imported aluminum tubes, no indication that they had sought to import magnets for use in centrifuge enrichments. The IAEA said they had no information suggesting that Iraq had a WMD program specifically with nuclear weapons. Well, we ignored what the IAEA told the UN and the world and us, and we instead went to war based upon a national intelligence estimate that said we didn't know what they were doing. And that decision locked us into a decade of combat operations to tragic cost. We know the rest of the story. 4,484 Americans lost their lives connected with the war in Iraq from 2003 to 2011, and another 32,246 Americans were wounded. And we also know this. It turned out that the IAEA was right, that once the war was waged, once we got in and gathered territory and then had our own ability to gather intelligence and information, we found that Iraq didn't have a program of weapons of mass destruction. So we went to war based upon a faulty assessment. We didn't have the information we need. Let's contrast what happened in 2002 and 2003 with the opportunity we now have before us as a result of the JCPOA. The agreement of Iran to follow for the next 25 years an enhanced inspection regime and be inspected by the IAEA to a standard that no other country in the world must follow is very, very unique. And it will provide us and all of our international partners with significant intelligence about Iran's program. And after year 25, Iran has also agreed to submit and follow the additional protocol of the IAEA which also guarantees significant intelligence and inspections. What does that give us? It arms us with information. It arms us with facts. It arms us with intelligence. Those are some of the best military assets we can have. With intelligence, we obviously hope Iran never makes a move to develop nuclear weapons. But with intelligence, if they do, we can blow the whistle and inform the world that they are violating paragraph 1, page 1 of the agreement, where they pledge never to seek, acquire, or develop nuclear weapons. With intelligence, we can make a wise decision rather than a blind decision, rather than whether to send American men and women into war to try to stop a nuclear weapons program. And with intelligence, we can even target military action to be more effective. That's what the JCPOA gives us that we didn't have before. That's what it gives us that we didn't have in Iraq, and we regret that we didn't have it. I'm interested, Senator Coons, on our recent visit to Israel. We were there within the last month. The tone seems to be changing a little bit in our dialogue with our Israeli allies about this deal, because the dramatic nature of the intelligence is now being seen by our strong allies in Israel as something that is potentially transformative. 2 days ago, the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces gave a speech in Tel Aviv. Gadi Eisenkot spoke on Monday at a national security conference in Tel Aviv, and he basically said this: look, the nuclear deal with Iran constitutes a strategic turning point. Didn't whitewash it. He says, quote, many risks, but also opportunities. What are the opportunities? He said the deal reduces the immediate Iranian threat to Israel because it rolls back Iran's nuclear capabilities and deepens the monitoring capabilities of the international community. After all the drama about it's a historic mistake, how refreshing it was to go to Israel a few weeks ago and hear security and intel officials talk about what this enhanced intelligence meant with respect to Israel's security. Now, we know there's no guarantee that a diplomatic deal will work out, and my colleagues have laid out the need for strict implementation. But we also know, and we've got the scar tissue, so this is painful knowledge, that we are much safer if we have better information. We're much safer if we have better intel. We will make much better decisions. I certainly pray that we will never again send American men and women into war based on a false intelligence assessment. And the only way we can guard against that eventuality is to have stronger intelligence. The IAEA inspections will give us better intelligence and should help us make better military decisions in the future. And with that, to my friend from Delaware, I would yield the floor back, and thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank the senator from Virginia. We had a terrific experience traveling together to Israel, to Turkey, to Saudi Arabia, to Vienna. In Vienna, we met with the leadership of the IAEA and asked tough questions and learned more about their needs and their plans for thoroughly inspecting every aspect of Iran's nuclear program. In Turkey and in Saudi Arabia, we heard from close regional allies their concerns that we need to strengthen our partnership with regional allies who are uncertain about the future with ISIS, but who were frankly grateful for the increased intelligence partnerships between the United States, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. But most importantly, with our vital ally Israel, as the good senator from Virginia has recounted, we heard from the Prime Minister, from the Minister of Defense, from opposition leadership, and from intelligence and defense community leaders that the partnership with the United States is stronger than it's ever been, and that they view this path forward with Iran as having challenges and opportunities. Opportunities in terms of intelligence to be gained, opportunities in terms of pushing back on what was a rapidly advancing Iranian nuclear infrastructure and program, and now a challenge to work together and to provide exactly the sort of oversight and engagement that only a duly empowered and active Congress can take. Let me close out this colloquy of 6 senators by making a few simple observations, if I might. Congress has an essential role to play in ensuring that this nuclear deal with Iran moves forward in our best national interest. Congress should not only provide oversight, but also take action. The simplest is a point to which Senator Shaheen spoke at length: the importance of confirming key national security nominees, essential to the enforcement of sanctions. Second, we can take proactive action here in this chamber by passing the Iran Policy Oversight Act. Its formation, its drafting was led by Senator Cardin of Maryland, but a dozen other colleagues, some who opposed and some who supported the deal, joined in being initial co-sponsors. It's a bill that would clarify some ambiguous provisions of the JCPOA, establish in statute America's commitment to enforcing the deal, engage us in more comprehensive efforts to counter Iranian activity in the Middle East, and provide increased support to our allies in the region, especially our vital ally, Israel. This is a step this body can and should take. And to do so would be much in the spirit, the bipartisan spirit that we saw in the Foreign Relations Committee between Chairman Corker and Ranking Member Cardin that produced the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. I think passing the Iran Policy Oversight Act would be strong and important contribution by this chamber. Speaking only for myself, I'll also say that I think we should reauthorize the Iran Sanctions Act, which is set to expire this year. Having that bill reauthorized, that law reauthorized, would provide a viable framework through which the United States could snap back sanctions if Iran violates the JCPOA. Each of the ideas that we've outlined, confirming vital national security nominees, passing enforcement legislation, and fully funding reliably and for the long term the IAEA, the inspections watchdog that is supposed to keep a close and persistent eye on Iran's nuclear facilities, these represent critical, concrete steps that Congress can take. The United States cannot enforce this complex deal alone. We have to keep building international support for the imposition of new sanctions to punish Iran for its ongoing human rights abuses, its illegal ballistic missile activity, its support for terrorism in the Middle East. But if we're going to be serious about our constitutional role to provide for the common defense and the general welfare, I would argue that we here in the Senate have a sacred obligation to provide not just oversight of this deal, but to also take action, to enforce its terms, to push back on Iran's bad behavior, and to demonstrate to the world that the United States is serious about securing a peaceful, nuclear-free future, difficult though that may be for the Middle East. With that, I'd like to thank my colleagues who joined me here on the floor and yield the floor.